Attention! Before watching this video, know that what you're about to discover will completely shatter your understanding of family loyalty. A mother betrays her entire family to the USSR, disappearing without explanation in the dead of night. 30 years later, her children finally uncover the devastating truth behind her betrayal, and what they find is far more horrifying than they ever imagined. Stay until the end, because the real reason she did it will leave you speechless. It was a freezing February night in 1962 when Margaret Sullivan walked out of her family home in Boston, Massachusetts, and never returned. She left behind her husband, Thomas, a decorated World War II veteran, and their 4 children: Robert, 15 years old, Catherine, 13, Michael, 10, and little Sarah, just 7 years old. No goodbye letter, no warning signs, no explanation. The breakfast dishes were still in the sink. Her coat remained hanging by the door. Her wedding ring sat on the bedside table. Margaret Sullivan had simply vanished into the cold winter darkness, leaving her family to wonder for 3 decades what could have driven a devoted mother to abandon everything she loved. But the truth, when it finally emerged in 1992, would reveal a story of espionage, sacrifice, and a choice so impossible that it would haunt her children for the rest of their lives. The morning after Margaret's disappearance, Thomas Sullivan woke to find his wife's side of the bed empty and cold. At first he assumed she had risen early, perhaps unable to sleep as she sometimes did. But as the hours passed and the children woke asking for their mother, a creeping dread began to settle over the household. Margaret was meticulous about routine. She always prepared breakfast for the children before school. She never left the house without telling someone where she was going. By noon, when she still hadn't returned and hadn't called, Thomas contacted the Boston Police Department to report his wife missing. The initial investigation found nothing suspicious. There were no signs of forced entry into the Sullivan home. Nothing appeared to be stolen or disturbed. Margaret's purse was gone, suggesting she had left voluntarily, but her suitcases remained in the closet. Her bank account showed no unusual withdrawals. The family car sat in the driveway with a full tank of gas. Neighbors reported seeing nothing unusual the night before. It was as if Margaret had simply decided to walk out into the night and disappear. But why would a loving mother abandon her 4 children without a word? Thomas was devastated and confused. He and Margaret had been married for 17 years. They had met in 1945, just after the war ended, when Thomas returned home from serving in the Pacific Theater. Margaret had been working as a secretary at a law firm in downtown Boston. Their courtship had been brief but intense, and they married within 6 months of meeting. By all accounts, theirs was a happy marriage. They had built a comfortable life in a modest 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood. Thomas worked as an accountant at a local manufacturing company. Margaret had stopped working after Robert was born, dedicating herself to raising their children. Friends and family described them as the perfect American family, the embodiment of post-war prosperity and domestic happiness. But there were things about Margaret that Thomas had never fully understood. She rarely spoke about her life before they met. He knew she had immigrated to America from somewhere in Eastern Europe as a teenager, but she was vague about the details. She claimed her parents had died when she was young and that she had no living relatives. She had a slight accent that she said was Polish, though Thomas, who had no ear for languages, never questioned this. Margaret was intensely private about her past, and Thomas had respected that privacy, assuming she had experienced trauma during the war years that she preferred not to revisit. Now, with her gone, those gaps in her history took on a sinister significance. The FBI became involved in the case within days of Margaret's disappearance. This was 1962, the height of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis would occur just 8 months later, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. Paranoia about Soviet infiltration ran deep in American society. When FBI agents learned that Margaret Sullivan was a foreign-born woman with an unclear background who had suddenly vanished without explanation, alarm bells rang. They began a thorough investigation into Margaret's past, and what they discovered would shock everyone who knew her. Margaret Sullivan was not who she claimed to be. Her real name was Magda Sokolov, and she had been born in 1925 in Leningrad, Soviet Union. She had not immigrated to America as a teenager fleeing war-torn Europe. She had been sent to America in 1944 as part of a Soviet intelligence operation, inserted into the United States with false documentation identifying her as a Polish refugee. She had spent a year in New York being trained in tradecraft, learning to blend seamlessly into American society, perfecting her English, studying American culture and customs. Her mission was long-term deep cover infiltration, to establish herself as an ordinary American citizen, marry, have children, build a normal life, all while gathering intelligence and waiting for activation orders that might come years or even decades in the future. The FBI's discovery sent shockwaves through the Sullivan family and the wider community. Thomas Sullivan, the patriotic war veteran who had fought against tyranny in the Pacific, had unknowingly married a Soviet spy. His children were the children of an enemy agent. Everything about their family life had been built on a foundation of deception. The revelation was devastating, but it also raised urgent questions. What intelligence had Margaret been gathering during her 18 years in America? Who were her contacts? What had she reported back to Moscow? And most pressingly, why had she disappeared now, in February 1962? Had she been recalled by her handlers? Had she been compromised and fled to avoid arrest, or was something else at play? The FBI interrogated Thomas Sullivan for days, but he could provide little useful information. He genuinely knew nothing about his wife's true identity or activities. Agents searched the Sullivan home from top to bottom, looking for hidden compartments, coded messages, radio equipment, anything that might indicate espionage activity. They found nothing. If Margaret had been actively spying, she had been extraordinarily careful to leave no physical evidence. The children were questioned as gently as possible given their ages, but they knew nothing. To them, Margaret had simply been their mother, loving and attentive, if perhaps a bit reserved and private compared to other mothers in the neighborhood. The FBI expanded their investigation, interviewing everyone Margaret had known. Her few friends described her as pleasant but somewhat distant, never quite opening up completely. She had been active in the local church, volunteering occasionally, but had never formed deep friendships. She had been a devoted mother, attending every school event, helping with homework, preparing elaborate meals. But she had also been careful, they now realized, never putting herself in situations where her background might be scrutinized too closely, never drawing attention to herself, maintaining the perfect cover of an ordinary suburban housewife. As weeks turned into months with no sign of Margaret, the FBI began to suspect she had successfully defected back to the Soviet Union. But how? The logistics of such an escape were daunting. She had left with nothing but her purse, no passport, no money beyond what she might have had in her wallet. Yet somehow she had vanished completely. The FBI theorized that she must have had a prearranged extraction plan, that Soviet handlers had picked her up that night and smuggled her out of the country, probably through Canada or Mexico, then onto the USSR via a circuitous route designed to avoid detection. For the Sullivan children, their mother's betrayal was incomprehensible. Robert, the eldest at 15, struggled with rage and shame. His mother was a Soviet spy. His entire childhood had been a lie. At school, he faced whispers and stares from classmates who had heard the news. Catherine withdrew into herself, barely speaking, unable to process the loss of her mother, combined with the revelation of who she really was. Michael, at 10, didn't fully understand the political implications, but felt the abandonment deeply. And little Sarah, just 7, simply cried every night for her mother, unable to comprehend why she had left. Thomas tried to hold the family together, but he was drowning in his own grief and betrayal. The woman he had loved for 17 years had never existed. Every memory was now tainted with the knowledge that Margaret had been playing a role, that their entire marriage had been part of her cover. Had she ever truly loved him? Had any of it been real? These questions tormented him. He began drinking heavily, struggling to maintain his job, barely able to care for his children. The FBI kept the family under surveillance for months, watching for any sign that Margaret might try to contact them, but no contact ever came. Years passed. The Sullivan children grew up carrying the weight of their mother's betrayal. Robert joined the military, perhaps trying to prove his loyalty to America, to distance himself from his mother's treason. He served in Vietnam and returned home damaged, haunted by what he had seen and done. Catherine became a teacher, pouring her energy into caring for other people's children, perhaps trying to understand the mother who had abandoned her own. Michael struggled with addiction and depression, never quite able to build a stable life. Sarah, the youngest, had the haziest memories of her mother, but carried the deepest scars, always wondering if she had done something wrong, if somehow she was to blame for her mother leaving. Thomas Sullivan died in 1979 of liver failure, his body destroyed by years of alcoholism. He went to his grave, never knowing why his wife had left, never understanding what had driven her to betray everything. The FBI had closed their active investigation years earlier, concluding that Margaret Sullivan, or Magda Sokolov, had successfully returned to the Soviet Union and was beyond their reach. The case file was archived, another Cold War mystery that would likely never be fully resolved. The children, now adults, tried to move on with their lives. They rarely spoke about their mother, the wound too deep and painful to examine, but they never forgot. How could they? The unanswered questions haunted them. Why had she left so suddenly? Why had she never tried to contact them even once in all the years since? Had she ever loved them at all, or had they been nothing more than props in her cover story, tools to make her appear more authentically American? Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War that had defined their entire lives suddenly ended. The Iron Curtain fell, archives began to open. Secrets that had been buried for decades started to emerge. And in 1992, 30 years after their mother's disappearance, the Sullivan children received a letter that would finally provide answers, though those answers would be far more painful than they ever imagined. The letter came from a lawyer in Moscow representing the estate of Magda Sokolov, deceased. She had died 6 months earlier of cancer at the age of 67. The lawyer explained that Magda had left specific instructions that her children in America were to be contacted after her death and given certain documents that would explain her actions. The lawyer included a thick envelope containing letters Magda had written to each of her children, along with a longer document detailing the full story of her life and the impossible choice she had been forced to make in February 1962. The 4 siblings gathered together for the first time in years to read their mother's final words. What they discovered would reframe everything they thought they knew about her betrayal. Magda's story, as revealed in her letters and the accompanying documents, was far more complex and tragic than anyone had imagined. Magda Sokolov had indeed been born in Leningrad in 1925. Her father had been a minor official in the Communist Party, her mother a schoolteacher. She had grown up during Stalin's purges, learning early to keep her head down and never question authority. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Magda was 16 years old. She watched her city endure the horrific 900-day siege of Leningrad, one of the longest and most destructive sieges in history. Over 1 million civilians died of starvation, disease, and cold. Magda's mother died in the first winter. Her father was killed fighting on the front lines in 1942. Orphaned and alone, Magda survived by working in a munitions factory, living on starvation rations, watching people die around her every day. When Soviet intelligence officers came to the factory in 1943, looking for young women who could pass as European refugees, Magda volunteered. It was a chance to escape the hell of besieged Leningrad, to have enough food to eat, to survive. She was 17 years old and had no idea what she was agreeing to. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, trained her for months. They taught her English, gave her a false identity as a Polish refugee, drilled her in American customs and culture. They told her she would be sent to America to gather intelligence, that she would be serving her country, that she was a hero of the Soviet Union. Magda, traumatized and desperate, did as she was told. In 1944, she was smuggled into the United States through a complex route involving neutral countries and false documents. For the first year, Magda lived in New York, reporting to her handlers, learning to be American. Then she was ordered to move to Boston and establish a more permanent cover. She was told to find work, to integrate into the community, and eventually to marry an American man to solidify her cover. She met Thomas Sullivan in 1945, and her handlers approved of him. A war veteran, stable employment, no family complications. He was perfect. Magda was ordered to pursue the relationship. But something unexpected happened. Magda fell in love with Thomas. It wasn't part of the plan, but it happened anyway. He was kind and gentle, damaged by his own war experiences, but trying to build a good life. For the first time since before the siege, Magda felt safe. When they married, she told herself she could make this work, that she could be both a loyal Soviet agent and a loving wife. When Robert was born, then Catherine, then Michael and Sarah, Magda's dual life became increasingly unbearable. She loved her children with a fierce intensity that surprised her. They were real in a way nothing else in her life had been since before the war. For years, Magda provided minimal intelligence to her handlers. She had no access to classified information, and she deliberately avoided situations where she might. She attended her meetings, passed along innocuous information about American life and culture, but nothing of real value. Her handlers seemed content with this arrangement. She was a sleeper agent, kept in place for potential future use, but not actively engaged in serious espionage. Magda allowed herself to believe that maybe she could live out her life this way, maintaining the fiction of being a spy while actually just being a wife and mother. Then in January 1962, everything changed. Magda's handler contacted her with urgent new orders. Soviet intelligence had learned that the FBI was conducting a sweep of suspected deep-cover agents in the Northeast. Magda's name was on a list of persons of interest. It was only a matter of time, perhaps weeks, before she would be investigated and her true identity discovered. She was being given a choice: return immediately to the Soviet Union, or stay and face arrest, trial, and almost certain execution for espionage. But there was a complication. If Magda stayed and was arrested, her children would be taken by the state. The children of convicted spies were often placed in institutions or foster care, their lives destroyed by their parents' crimes. Thomas, as the husband of a Soviet spy, would also face intense scrutiny and possible prosecution for failure to report her activities, even though he genuinely knew nothing. The family would be torn apart, the children stigmatized forever as the offspring of a traitor. Magda's handlers presented her with an alternative. If she returned to the Soviet Union immediately and quietly, they would ensure that her family was protected. The FBI would be told that she had fled, but there would be no public trial, no media circus. Thomas and the children would be investigated but ultimately cleared. They would be able to live relatively normal lives, free from the worst consequences of her espionage. But the price was that Magda could never contact them again. Any attempt to reach out would put them in danger, would draw attention back to them, would potentially expose them to prosecution. Magda had less than 24 hours to decide: stay with her family and watch them be destroyed by her past, or leave them and give them a chance at a normal life. It was an impossible choice, but in the end, there was really no choice at all. She loved her children too much to let them suffer for her sins. On that freezing February night in 1962, Magda kissed each of her sleeping children one last time, looked at her husband sleeping peacefully, and walked out of the house knowing she would never see any of them again. The extraction was quick and efficient. A car picked her up 2 blocks from her house and drove her to a safe house in New York. Within 48 hours, she was on a Soviet freighter heading across the Atlantic. She spent the voyage in a tiny cabin below deck, crying for the family she had abandoned, knowing she had made the only choice she could, but hating herself for it nonetheless. Back in the Soviet Union, Magda was debriefed extensively. She provided what little intelligence she had gathered over the years, which was deemed largely worthless. She was not punished for her minimal contributions. The KGB understood that her value had been in her deep cover status, not in active intelligence gathering. She was given a small apartment in Moscow, a modest pension, and a job as a translator. She lived quietly for the next 30 years, never remarrying, never having more children, spending her days working and her nights remembering the family she had lost. Magda followed her children's lives from afar as best she could. Soviet intelligence occasionally provided updates, gleaned from routine surveillance and open-source information. She learned that Thomas had become an alcoholic, that Robert had joined the military, that her children were struggling. Every piece of news was a knife in her heart. She had sacrificed everything to protect them, and they were suffering anyway. But she could never reach out, could never explain, could never tell them that she had left because she loved them, not because she didn't. As the years passed and the Cold War began to thaw, Magda held out hope that maybe someday she could contact her children, could explain everything. But the opportunity never came. The rules that had governed her life for so long remained in place. Any contact would still be dangerous, still potentially expose them to scrutiny. So she remained silent, carrying her grief and guilt alone. When Magda was diagnosed with terminal cancer in 1991, she knew her time was running out. The Soviet Union was collapsing around her, the system she had served and sacrificed for crumbling into dust. In her final months, she wrote letters to each of her children, pouring out everything she had never been able to say. She explained her true identity, her recruitment, her years as a sleeper agent. She described the impossible choice she had been given in 1962 and why she had made the decision she did. She told them that leaving them had been the hardest thing she had ever done, that she had thought about them every single day for 30 years, that she had loved them more than life itself. Magda arranged for these letters to be delivered after her death, when there would be no more danger to her children, when the Cold War that had defined and destroyed so many lives was finally over. She died in a Moscow hospital in January 1992, alone except for a nurse who didn't know her story. Her last words were the names of her 4 children. When Robert, Catherine, Michael, and Sarah finished reading their mother's letters, they sat in stunned silence. Everything they had believed about her betrayal was wrong. She hadn't abandoned them because she was a heartless spy who valued her ideology over her family. She had left to protect them, to give them a chance at a life not destroyed by her past. It was an act of love, not betrayal, though it had felt like betrayal for 30 years. The siblings struggled to process this revelation. On one hand, they finally understood why their mother had left. On the other hand, 30 years of pain and abandonment couldn't be erased by an explanation, no matter how compelling. Robert, now 45 years old and still carrying the scars of Vietnam, found himself crying for the first time in decades, mourning not just the mother he had lost, but the mother he had never really known. Catherine felt a complex mix of relief and renewed grief. Understanding at last, but also realizing that her mother had died alone, never able to see her children again. Michael, whose life had been derailed by addiction and depression, wondered if things might have been different if he had known the truth earlier. And Sarah, the youngest, felt cheated of the closure she might have had if her mother had been able to explain while she was still alive. The letters also contained practical information. Magda had saved money over the years, a modest sum by American standards, but significant by Soviet standards. She left it all to her children, along with photographs she had kept of them from before she left, worn and faded from being looked at so many times. There were also documents from Soviet archives that Magda had obtained in her final months, files detailing her recruitment, her training, her years in America. She wanted her children to have the full truth, not just her version of it. The siblings made a decision together. They would not publicize their mother's story. The Cold War was over, but the pain was still too raw, too personal. They would keep the letters and documents private, sharing them only with their own children when the time was right. Magda Sokolov, also known as Margaret Sullivan, would remain a mystery to the outside world, another footnote in the vast secret history of Cold War espionage. But privately, the siblings began the difficult process of re-evaluating their memories of their mother. They looked at old photographs with new eyes, seeing not a traitor, but a woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control, trying to protect the children she loved. They remembered small moments, the way she had held them when they were scared, the songs she had sung in a language they now realized was Russian, the sadness that sometimes flickered across her face when she thought no one was looking. They began to understand that their mother had been living a tragedy, torn between two identities, two loyalties, two loves that could never be reconciled. Robert found some peace in understanding that his mother's sacrifice had been for him and his siblings. He began attending therapy, finally addressing the trauma of his childhood and his war experiences. Catherine wrote a memoir, never published, working through her feelings about her mother and her own experiences of loss and abandonment. Michael entered rehab and, with the support of his siblings, finally got clean. Sarah, who had spent her life wondering if she was somehow to blame for her mother leaving, finally understood that she had been loved, that her mother's departure had been an act of love, not rejection. The four siblings grew closer in the years following the revelation, united by their shared understanding of their mother's impossible choice. They met regularly, sharing memories, supporting each other through the ongoing process of grief and acceptance. They established a small scholarship fund in their mother's memory, helping children of immigrants pursue education, a quiet way of honoring the woman who had been caught between two worlds. Today, more than 30 years after receiving their mother's letters, the Sullivan siblings are elderly themselves. Robert is in his 70s, his health failing, but his mind finally at peace. Catherine is a retired teacher, surrounded by former students who remember her kindness. Michael has been sober for decades, working as a counselor helping others struggling with addiction. Sarah is a grandmother, passing on to her grandchildren the complicated story of their great-grandmother, who made an impossible choice out of love. They sometimes wonder what their lives might have been like if their mother had made a different choice, if she had stayed and faced arrest. Would they have been better off knowing the truth from the beginning, even if it meant growing up as the children of a convicted spy? Or was their mother right to protect them by leaving, even though it meant 30 years of not understanding why? There are no easy answers to these questions, and the siblings have learned to live with the ambiguity. What they do know with certainty is that their mother loved them. That love was real, even if everything else about her identity was constructed. In the end, that's what matters most. Magda Sokolov, the Soviet spy, made the ultimate sacrifice not for her country or her ideology, but for her children. She gave up everything, her family, her identity, her chance at happiness, so that they might have a chance at a normal life. It was an act of love so profound that it took 30 years to understand, but once understood, it changed everything. The story of Margaret Sullivan is a reminder that the Cold War was not just about nations and ideologies, but about individual human beings caught in impossible situations, forced to make choices that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Behind every spy, every defector, every betrayal, there were real people with real families, real loves, real losses. The grand narratives of history are built on countless small tragedies, and Magda's story is just one of thousands that will never be fully known. For the Sullivan children, their mother's betrayal turned out to be the opposite of what they had believed for 3 decades. She didn't betray them. She saved them at the cost of everything she held dear. It's a truth that brings both comfort and renewed pain, understanding mixed with the grief of lost time, of a relationship that could never be repaired because it was discovered too late. But it's also a truth that has allowed them to finally make peace with their past and with the mother they lost so long ago. So what would you have done in Magda's position? Would you have stayed with your family and faced the consequences, or would you have left to protect them, knowing you could never explain why? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.